welcome to Varn Blog, and today we have Sean from Antifada and other stuff, I guess. History as a Weapon, which I guess is an Antifada sub-project, with us today. And we had a very illuminating discussion about labor that we neglected to record. So we're recording it now.
I thought we were recording, so if I was pedantic towards you, I apologize if I was talking down to you.
Okay. So you and I have both been very interested in communization theory for a long time. I am a critic of communization theory, however, with the caveat that of the recent trends in capital, they've been some of the most astute observers. I engaged on I don't know how many hours it's going to be when it's released, but it was about 18 hours, between 12 and 18 hours of recording on going through all the claims made in the history of separation in Notes Volume 4. I'm infinitely a defender of the Duvet side of the Duvet theory communist debates, and in Notes Volume 1, although I have my problems with Duvet as well, but I thought the debates on the failure to the conception of class as posited by most Marxists do lead into this kind of, and actually this is a problem in Marxism historically in general, where we posit, hey, we want to get rid of a thing. What are we going to do to get rid of a thing? Do more of the thing. So we need to get rid of, the workers need to have no country, but we need to break up these, non-bourgeois empires. We're going to encourage nationalism, and we're just going to assume that economic development is going to dissolve the nationalism away. Similarly, with state capitalism, we know that we need to develop means of production. We're going to take on a capitalist developmental policy, but we're going to put it in the hands of a proletarian sympathetic state, develop that. Well, when that fails, what's going to happen? We'll just outright capitalism. So again, looks like we're spreading the very thing we want to get rid of. And similarly, with the idea of workerism, I am one of these people who has never, I don't engage in the kind of nonsense that you see with a lot of the identitarian left that kind of posits that workers are somehow inherently reactionary because liberals told them so once.
Or I presuming too, you don't do the tailism of right nationalists who are constantly talking about, like, because the workers do it, it's good.
Right.
Because there's chauvinism, that means that it's like inherently working class to be chauvinist.
Right, because workers are inherently chauvinistic, or at least a section of workers we're interested in profiling at any given moment. But there has been this converse tendency that you and I have both observed recently of, in theology, we used to talk about this as the God thinks like me problem, where the abstract that you don't really have any contact with actually confirms all your personal biases. And I think that there's been a lot of that with the social democrats and workers, where like workers are basically whatever we want them to be and what they believe. They all secretly, they're all secretly super progressive, and they believe in all these progressive policies. And on economic issues, they tend to. They're not. They either are when we don't like them, or aren't when we want them on our side. Racist, and again, racial attitudes amongst the working class and any objective demographic are all over the place. Like,
especially without the leadership of a proletarian party, right?
Right. I mean,
yeah. Well, so, there's this broader tendency. I feel like I've been noticing this a lot for years, to only posit the existence of the working class when it behaves in certain ways and certain tendencies, which is part of, I think, like the Marxist-Leninists and social democratic legacy of only seeing of the working class only appearing when it becomes a political subject, right? Whereas, if you've been looking at what's been happening over the last 6 to 8 months, the class struggle has been serious, and the working class has been self-activated just in ways that like don't don't land on the newspaper as like explicitly political, but 30 million workers quitting their jobs over the last 8 months is pretty serious. The sort of like quiet, so almost general strike around the COVID period, when tens of millions of workers refused to go into work until they were baited back with this essential workers sort of propaganda press that everybody got. And, you know, like without any real party representing them, this wave of worker self-activity within the unions that led to the strike wave of Striketober, as they call it. You know, these are all elements of like the working class being for itself and acting atomistically in its own interest. But again, like only when, for many people on the left, it's only when the working class acts as they suppose that the working class should act that they actually recognize the class, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's. I used to have this debate with a lot of people, even a lot of people who aren't Marxist, Leninist, or about the only real manifestation of the class is the class for itself, and the class in itself is completely irrelevant. Now, for those who don't know their Marxist jargon, this is the Hegelian framework of Marxism. The class in itself is basically a sociological framework. It is the working class as it exists in capital, known to itself. And the class for itself is when it acts in its own interest. And there's this tendency, I tend to call this political creationism, actually, where you, and this is actually a critique I have of Endnotes Volume 4, because they actually endorse this position, even though their argument doesn't require it, that the working class movements of let's say the early 20th century, from like 1905, from the clear end of the Long Depression, all the way through post-war social compact, was a clear political manufactured movement, that it had little organic substance, which I don't believe. I think labor history doesn't bear that out. But I do think they hit the wall that even Edward Bernstein saw, which was the fact that the industrial proletariat in specific, the productivist parts of the proletariat, was never going to be the majority of the population, which totally screws up actually both the insurrectionary and the democratic platform.
It was meant to be the antagonistic pole socialized into production, into a mass discipline. And it was also supposed to be that sector of the class that then hegemonically pulls the rest of the elements towards it and overcomes. And that just, that's like one of the main takeaways from History of Separation, right? Is to say that this was never, maybe for a minute in like Germany or something at a certain time, it was reality, but it never happened. So then what are the consequences of that for Marxist political theory?
Right. And I think the other complications that I've heard not enough people talk about is, in the earliest 20th century, we all knew imperialism was a problem. We never defined what it really was. I mean, for example, in Lenin, it's a combination of monopoly capital plus the need for primitive accumulation, leading to the conflict between states and the need to expand markets. But then it doesn't make, what Lenin doesn't answer is, are they over or underdeveloping the quote unquote developing world? So are they deliberately suppressing it to keep it as a place to dump over accumulation, or are they developing it as a means of primitively accumulating? Those are actually different questions,
right?
And they're not answered. I mean, historically, what we see is a mixture of both. This whole divided and uneven development. But even that, like when you start dealing with national liberation movements and stuff, it becomes very strange in the Marxist context. So you heard the development of a whole new class theory called the comprador bourgeois, which is ironically the internationalist bourgeois, which is bad, as opposed to
the national bourgeois, which is good. They can get their own star on the flag.
But
they can be part of a block of 4 classes.
Exactly. but then you have to deal with but that's not, like, we obviously can't advocate that in the imperial world, because the nationalist bourgeois but then we have to assume that they'll never be that like none of these groups and small countries could ever be imperialist nations, which is the assumption that they just won't develop. Which is wild. I mean, we were talking about The Long 20th Century, which I think is a great book. One of the reasons why I didn't take it seriously for a long time, though, is I saw it as being too soft on China.
Interesting. Arrighi famously wrote Adam Smith in the 21st Century,
right?
Which is about China. China kind of taking the lead now as the world power. I don't think I read the whole thing, but yeah,
Adam
Arrighi...
Smith in the 20th Century, I think, is the book where it's like all these world systems theorists who will talk about the fact that there's still more product leaving China than staying in it means that it's semi-periphery versus core country. But then I'm like, but that's true of Germany, and it's always been true of Germany. You're gonna tell me that Germany's semi-periphery?
I mean, what? So the China thing aside, the reason why Arrighi is fascinating to me, and why I kind of integrated into my my theorizing about the long sweep of capitalist history, is because it posits, using Braudel, using Wallerstein, definitely using Marx, and using Adam Smith too. It kind of it posits like a cyclical framework for understanding the rise and fall of various different capitalist imperial hegemonies, and it's very like the systemic cycles of accumulation is what Arrighi calls it. And it's, for all you Marx fans out there, it's really fun because you have a M to C phase for these imperial projects where like money is turned into capital and you have like these growing industrial economies, but then a signal crisis comes in and all of a sudden all that C is turned into M prime, and you have this financialization process that doesn't destroy the empire, but it leads to like the slow demise of it when another capitalist regime of accumulation can arise and start this process over again. And what was compelling to me about it was always that he looks at the rise and fall. He looks at the decline of the British Empire in the early 20th century, its signal crisis being, of course, the First World War, and its second being the Second World War, with a moment of turbulence in between. And then he says that in the 1970s, the United States saw its signal crisis, and that there would be a terminal crisis someday. So I've always thought of 2008, 2009 as the terminal crisis for the American sort of imperial project and an entire phase of capitalist accumulation. And I think that, if anything, over the last years, it's kind of been maybe borne out a little bit. I'm feeling optimistic about its predictive abilities at this point. You're into Turchin, right?
I am into Turchin.
I've never read Turchin, but it sounds like maybe similar, using Cleometrics. I don't know.
Yeah, it's similar using Cleometrics, but it's based off of Turchin. I'm going to say this. I'm into Turchin, but I'm going to start off by saying I think Turchin's a reactionary and not admitting it. Because of the nationalist bias of the data, is at least methodologically nationalist. So, for example, when he talks about the post-war social contract, he doesn't mention War II making the U.S. the wealthiest country on the planet. He mentions like, oh, there was this social compact and like there was social collaboration, and then
that's like that's the lead, and that's the headline, right. And the fact that over like 50% of the productive capital of the world existed in the United States, that like something saying like 70-80% of Europe's productive capital had been literally physically destroyed.
Right, and it wasn't developed or destroyed in Asia too. So I mean, like, it's a pretty big deal. And also, I think Paul Maddox Sr. was the best writer on this, and he wrote it contemporaneously, that he saw that the Keynesian International was actually a way to build a transnational capitalist polity.
You're talking about the book Marx and Keynes?
Yep. And there's an essay in it called The Keynesian International where he talks about the use of Keynesianism and the use of the Marshall Plan, which was not as innocent as everyone thought, and that capital was going to get sick of, and that the capitalists were going to get sick of paying for it to expand it out beyond the borders of Europe, meaning then that the kinds of accumulation that would have to be done in Latin America and the European, in the non-European transatlantic zone would have to resemble earlier phases of primitive accumulation and not this Keynesian stuff. Which, of course, Maddox was was a council communist, but also one of the weird ones who was a Grossmanite.
Terminal crisis to councils.
Right. So I mean, we don't know a lot about what the council communists thought beyond Pannekoek, because most of them are dead. So I mean, did not live through World War II.
Right.
So
or the German revolutions afterward.
Yeah, I mean, Jan Appel got it to like 1919, I think, and that's the best you're gonna do. What I think what we have to look at that though is if you see that in the hindsight, what you see is, an imperial project that was imperializing Europe, but under terms that were super favorable. But were not super favorable to everybody else.
Oh well, because essential to the particular type and span of this American imperial project that arises out of the Bretton Woods Agreement is not, of course, direct state domination of the United States over Europe, but it's instead a hegemony out of which the United States controls the powerful institutions, has obviously a favorable monetary and situation, is able to export not just capital and commodities, but also, of course, technologies, which is the great, gamble that the Europeans took. And so, like, it's more the American imperial project, at least in the capitalist core, or as it relates to the capitalist core, is very much one of like core periphery hegemony and pulling and making like an environment safe for capital and safe for capitalist states that kind of draws all the other powers around it in cooperation between the ruling classes with the United States at the center. So like that's again when we talk about imperialism, right? Like it's about imperialistic as we get. But if you're thinking of it in terms of like 19th or early 20th century imperialism, you're going to miss that whole story of the post-war compact and the last 70 years.
Honestly, and when I say this pisses people off, but if you read Kautsky's Ultra Imperialism, actually describes what happens after World War II.
Hey, chalk one up for the K-man.
Whereas Lenin's imperialism describes what was going on prior to World War II. But could not have factored the Soviet Union's own equation into the situation. I mean, I would also say, like, part of the problem that Marxists always have, and it's a big problem intellectually, but it's also a big problem politically, is that we tend to come up with new class theories actually when they're no longer relevant. Like, for example, the current PMC thesis is really about the post-war social compact, even if people don't realize it. They tend to come up with periodizations after they're not relevant. So neoliberalism, while it's been talked about and used, it wasn't, Marxists didn't invent the term.
Yeah.
The explosion of discussing about David Harvey on the left and that particular politically deterministic theory of neoliberalism perfectly coincides with neoliberalism being kind of a dead project.
Exhausted. Well, right. I mean, it was GFW Hegel himself who said the owl of Minerva flies at dusk, right? Like right. We're always only ever able to understand a historical period when it's in its decline, which is why, like as much as I was talking about Arrighi and my theories about how we're in a similar period of turbulence where what we call neoliberalism, this regime of accumulation, what we call the American imperial project, is like all basically exhausted and in its decline. That doesn't say much about what comes after that, because we're living in this time of turbulence and change, and it's very difficult. Of course, it's impossible for us to step outside of that and like scientifically analyze the sort of trends that in 10 to 15 years we're going to have a better sense of what was going on in the period, what was being created and what was being discarded. So we live in a fascinating, interesting time, but like I think imperative, and this has been my real political project, imperative has been to get Marxists or communists or anarchists or whoever, people who are sympathetic to the project of abolishing capitalism eventually, to understand the stakes, to understand the position that we're in. You're fighting against neoliberalism when neoliberalism is exhausted. It's a dead letter at this point in time. Try to understand that this is like a crisis period in which there's going to be more room for activity right now for a quote unquote left than there would have been in, say, the 1980s and 1990s, because a lot of shit is up for grabs. We talked about, like, before the recording, we talked about definitions of neoliberalism, and we talked about, like, David Harvey's sort of vulgar political reading of what neoliberalism was, which was a ruling class project. It was a political choice. It was the Mont Pelerin Society. It was it was
MMTers, monetary theorists, and the center, and right populists now all believe everybody on that. So basically, the left, the center, and the right have adopted a politically determinist view in regards to this. The way they frame it's differently, but they, like, even the Alex Jonesers talk about neoliberals as if it was kind of like
it was the Jews, basically.
Yeah,
it's like a structurally anti-Semitic theory where it's a small cabal, that's working behind the scenes in order to, like, to mold society to their image. When the reality of the situation, if you look at it, of course, is that the rise of neoliberalism, it wasn't completely determined, but it was basically the contours of it arose out of some serious incentives on the part of the ruling class to figure out the 1970s profitability crisis. And you had, for a ruling class that used trial and error, right, until the Volcker shock comes, you had, like, various avenues in which you could have fixed or tried to address this profitability crisis. But the easiest one, the one that's, like, right in front of the capitalist faces, individual capitalists and capital as a whole, was smashing up a relatively strong working class. I mean, it didn't take them. I mean, you can gild the lily. You can put all the fine Mont Pelerin, Hayekian language around what this project is really meant to be, but they saw directly in front of them. If we have a profitability crisis, smash the the working class, smash them right up, and marketize a whole bunch of shit, privatize a whole bunch of shit, and there you go. There you have neoliberalism. But it didn't come out of the heads of these people like some fully formed project. It was, again, like, very much determined by the political economy and social conditions of the 1970s, as we are today, of course, too.
Yeah. So the big thing was to smash up the state, the sectors of state capital, but not turn them into true markets. This is where I think people don't understand what neoliberalism does. It actually compels markets. It forces you to enter markets, as opposed to a truly, like, what we would call the heroic phase of capital, which admittedly we all know never actually exist. I mean, the enclosures weren't done privately, and no monetary system comes without a cost. Yeah. So they're all enforced somehow, because a monetary system requires someone to run the exchanges. That requires some use of surplus, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Even Marx is a little naive on this. At least in his, and when I say that, people get, oh, but I mean,
not St. Marx.
Yeah,
Varn, not St. Marx. Okay, we cannot admit any.
Because my friend of me, Colin Drum, has pointed out to me that money has a price, and it's the price to maintain the monetary system. So, like, you can't say that there's no price to money.
I've watched you and Colin Dunn, and I've tried to read Colin Dunn, and I hate to say it's over my head, man. That guy's on some
which is funny shit. Because, like,
I want to understand it, but I don't.
But you read in notes, and it's like, oh, this is okay. But,
oh yeah. Well, no, it's like anything. You take like a decade to train yourself in the jargon and, like, ways of thinking of a certain discipline, or, like, let's just call Marxism a mode of analysis or whatever, and then you're like, I got that down pat, and then anything outside of that, you're like, oh god, I have to do this again.
Right? Yeah, we got to learn medieval monetary history and talk about the debates.
Talk about the Bank of London in the fucking 16th century. No.
Right, and why was metalism ever a thing? But I do think we have to. This is all important, because I don't know that I am a terminal breakdown theory, but I do think a theorist. But I do think the more that people tell me that that crisis is like what saves capital every time, but pretends that it goes back to the same form of capital, even if the basic exploitation and commodity dynamics apply. That's not true. And my biggest pushback on that is how much of your life is increasingly tied into rents, because people know that the commodity portions are not profitable.
Right. As a historical legacy of the last 12 to 40 years or whatever.
Yeah. Right. I mean, like everything's been turned into a rent market.
Yeah.
And
well, I mean, sorry,
mm-hmm.
Go ahead.
No, it used to be technologically driven, and that we like the ability to produce commodities have been technologically squished down to nothing.
Well, listen, like if we want to get serious about thinking about this, right? Thinking about this profitability crisis that we're in right now, have been in for a while, using whatever metrics you want. But if we assume, right, that there's a profitability crisis right now, I think you can see, in my mind, I think globalization, or like you can call it the spatial fix in like the good work of Harvey. You could talk about like the spatial reorganization of capital, communication and logistics technology. You can talk about this grand sweep that we call globalization over the last 30 or 40 years, the opening of the proletarianization of hundreds of millions of East Asians, bringing them into commodity production for the first time. These vast reservoirs of like a latent working class that arises with the fall of really existing communism. Like this whole regime of accumulation, we can call it that, had as its precepts certain very particular modalities and processes, has reached its limit. I think that's one of the things that we've seen over the last like 3 or 4 years. We're seeing this supply chain crisis now. We're seeing in the fact that you can't pay a Chinese worker what you could 20 years ago. They are winning and demanding a middle income lifestyle. So the end of this process, like the exhaustion of globalization as a capitalist process, presumes that there's going to be its opposite, that there's going to be a return to nationally bounded capital. You're going to have a deglobalization process. You've seen already the stirrings of this politically in the United States and Europe, talking about the pivot to China, talking about shortening supply lines, talking about a new Cold War, right, which would presumably put up more barriers to like the Chimerica project, essentially, of commodity production. And so, like, if anything, if things remain the same right now, I think what we're looking at is like a return to national capital. We're seeing a return to nationalism, both politically and economically. And that's I don't think it's going to go back to like necessarily the nationally bounded and industrial, the ISI sort of complex of the 1950s to 70s. I think it's probably going to be more violent than that, and that's the scary thing.
Well, what I say, like, for example, is people are worried about like a World War III between China and the United States, which I don't actually see on the horizon at all. I also think the new Cold War rhetoric is something that everyone's playing with because of renationalization. You hear this is also talk of onshoring.
Yeah.
And you will hear this talk across the board. The fact that the political right has turned on neoliberalism too is an indication that it's not only dead, but it's been dying for about a decade.
Yes.
Because they're only defending stuff that's not going to work. I mean, like,
right.
I hate to. It's actually funny. The best analysis of what the right actually does is not from any leftist. It's from Demestre, Joseph Demestre, which points out that
that's French
arch reactionary, the French arch reactionary, who points out that conservatism will only call itself that if it is part of a dying regime. That the moment that something is in a conservative or reactionary moment, truly in any way, it's actually already lost. That's why he pushed reactionarism as opposed to conservatism in this idealist sense. But there is a sense in which he's correct in that what we saw with the Republicans during the Bush years in particular, which was this major neoliberal turn, was saving a system that was already more or less reaching the period of exhaustion.
Yeah.
The question is, though, is you don't see social democracy coming back.
No.
Nor do you see neo-Fordism, which a lot of people naively at the beginning of the Biden administration thought was coming back as well. That we were going to see this massive neo-Fordist push and part of, as part of like this Green New Deal reinvestment, rent-seeking thing. And we're not seeing that either. The only economy that's been able to weather this and cleanly has been China.
Right.
And it has suffered way more costs than anybody seems to be giving it credit for.
It's in the midst of its own real estate crisis right now as we speak that is not yet resolved.
I mean, and you've seen this cultural turn in China as well, where you've seen something like actually, I mean, it's funny that when people talk about the socialism of China, and you point out that, like, well, this is just like the Red New Deal is basically a more souped up, slightly better version of the Great Society program in America. It's like, I'm like, it's not even particularly that socialist. You know, you guys talk about like China's ability to handle COVID, and it did, but like, you're also talking about a country, a quote communist country that has a medical system that, despite having state doctors that are very low paid, actually works. It's one of the few countries in the world where it works a lot closer to the U.S. You have a system also of vast property wealth through speculation that actually did benefit people who, if they were workers specifically in the late 80s and early 90s, that come by their homes in that time period. So, you know, there's all these things about China that the American left doesn't understand. But it's handled this better, and we've not handled it at all. We seem to be
impossible for us to handle it seems.
Like, and this is where the political stuff amuses me. Like, yes, some of this is political choices. There was a different way to handle the signal crisis of the 70s than what was handled politically and socially.
You would have to have deepened workers' power. It's the only way you do it is that you do Meidner plans.
Right.
That's it. That was your choice with like what was on the table at that point. But the political power and energy wasn't there in order to make that a reality because of the way that the social democratic, the labor parties, the socialist parties, the unions had all been captured by a certain, I don't know, capitalist realism about how.
I mean, the unions are still captured. I mean, it was funny because even someone like Michael Brooks and I was talking about like reading Bill Bradley, where Bill Bradley was more honest about the problems of paying. You know, this is like third way center Democrat stuff. Where they're like, well, the unions, you know, union leadership's being paid in stock options is going to, you know, lead to massive problems, and there's no tie to this. And also, close shop unions.
The UAW training center scandal. You read about that? That's just like the perfect encapsulation of the way in which unions became this corrupted broker of labor power, basically like a untouchable, unimpeachable bureaucratic layer that would survive and thrive no matter how shitty the contracts concessions they bargained away would be.
And to be fair, we've still seen that. I mean, I've even talked recently about the madness of some of the Teamsters, and the Teamsters are relatively radical for a mainstream business union. But like, if you look at the Teamsters being willing to use basically gig labor to maintain, you know, to maintain a subsection of its own workforce is wild. So the big thing there was the Teamsters contract where they allowed during Christmas season gig work in their own vehicles so that to relieve the pressure on
UPS workers.
UPS workers.
Yeah,
yep, exactly. Yeah. And even though they got sued over it in the state of New York. UPS's defense was that the idea came from the union, and the bargaining team purged members of the bargaining team that opposed that step.
Sounds about right.
You know, so like,
well, that's
I'm in a union, and
I'm in a union too. I'm in the carpenters union. I know this as well as anybody. But like this ties back to when we're talking about why a social democratic option is not on the table. Part of that is that there's not like a working class, like an organized collective working class base for that. Right. You know, like there's a middle class / working class base for, I guess, maybe 20, 30, 40% of the population for something like a Green New Deal or whatever. There's not any real talk about like, you know, workers syndicates or like even like sectoral bargaining at this point in time,
or oppositional bargaining.
Oppositional bargaining
is generally off the table. That's nuts.
Yeah.
Like,
I mean, to be fair, like the PRO Act, which people were floating around, is like this, of course, immensely corporatist document, right? It would strengthen the business unions that already exist in this country, albeit the 8% of the private sector that's unionized in this
yes,
country.
it's like what's something like 13% or 14. What is it?
With public sector workers, it's like 13 or 14%.
13%, but it's only 8% of the private sector.
Right.
Public sector eclipses private sector of like 2 to 1 or something like that.
The one thing that the PRO Act does that's really exciting is it finally repeals the 1947 Taft-Hartley ban on secondary boycotts and sympathy strikes, which I think, honestly, I can't believe that the fucking ruling class would allow those things back. That was like the most powerful weapon the American working class had, which is why it had to be taken away.
But that's why you're not getting the PRO Act.
That's why you're not getting it.
I mean, because I mean, like, let's be honest, because Taft-Hartley was designed, and I do think this was intentional, to make sure what had happened even in Israel, even in the UK, and definitely in the case of Germany. People don't know the history of the SPD. They think it was like this Marxist party. It was a Lassallean party. The actual Marxist party was actually apparently worse. After Marx died, when they entered, the Opera program, blah, blah, blah. But what it started out as is a political organization that was a coalition of unions.
Mm-hmm.
It was not...
like the Labor Party.
Right. It was not it wasn't like... that's also true for the Labor Party, and it's true for the Labor Party in most countries. That is not, nothing like that has ever happened in the United States, and Taft-Hartley made sure that it couldn't.
Yes. No American Labor Party. So can't have it.
And people think, oh, it's just big business. There's also the Democrats making sure that there was no real threat
100%.
to their weird coalition.
100%. And it had the nice knockoff effect of purging the entire left wing of the union movement. All the people, all the leadership, mostly Communist Party affiliated and Socialist Party affiliated, Trotskyists in some cases, who were serious about turning unions into like a powerful political force in this country, as they had been in the 1930s.
Basically, the leadership of the CIO gets purged.
Yeah. I mean, you had literal oaths. You had to like swear that you were not a communist or else you were thrown out. I mean, that's another kind of underdeveloped, I think, history that people have in this country is like, Taft-Hartley, which the Democrats for decades have said is like the slave labor bill or whatever. But really, the Wagner Act itself was like the most effective attempt in order to curtail workers' power in this country. Yeah. If you saw the kind of self-organization and self-activity that the working class in this country overtook in the mid-1930s, early to mid-1930s, that scared the shit out of them. And so you had to basically, what ends up being implemented is a way to circumscribe workers' power in this country.
What they never wanted again was something like the populist movement of the late 19th century, which was able to like take over state houses with guns. So like,
or the sit-down strikes,
right.
the disruption of production. I mean, this is in the 1930s, like the return of, as I was saying before, like when you talk about the difference between the 70s and today, the return of a working class as like a serious historical subject in the United States. In the 1970s, the working class, the rank and file was that as well, but they were wildcat striking against their fucking unions,
right?
En masse.
It's one of these things that I always point out to people, like third periodism is terrible for the European left, but it's actually good for the American left. Because during third periodism, you do not have this coalition with the Democrats. The communists are organizing independent lines. They're the only group, even more than the socialists, after dealing with national chauvinist policies, dealing with organizing the Black Belt, realizing, like, even from a practical standpoint. I mean, one thing I like to point out to people is the South was used as a textile mill. You know why textile mills are where they are? And like white workers in the South made less than union black workers did, in so much that there were union black workers. It was because any attempt to, and Carnegie of all people figured this out in Pennsylvania, in Appalachia. If you could pretend to be progressive by using black workers to break up a strike. And it actually, interestingly, was used in ways that to talk in racial politics, turned groups that were not considered white. So it pushed groups like Cornish and Manx
Cornish
miners,
tin miners, yeah,
right, into the white category because black workers were used to break up their strikes.
But we should talk about class only. Let's not
right.
muddle things with racial categories when it comes to class composition in the United States.
Or reverse it, race only. Why was any of this ever done? Right? Was it just because it was a bunch of white bigots who wanted to keep all the black men down?
That's not why slavery happened either, you fucking ding-dongs.
Right. I mean, it's also why. I mean, that's also why whiteness and not some other national subject was used, and why that's particular to the settled colonial states, because the ability to expand people's maladaptive sympathy with the ruling class was useful. That doesn't exist in your until the transatlantic trade. So this deep history cycles are really, to bring it back, are really important. And our discussions right now, I think it's amazing that we live in this world where the 1619 project is posited on one end and Chud MAGA is posited on another.
1776 project.
Yeah, and I'm like, okay, but we live literally just demographically. The white-black battle, those are two minority groups. And they're ones that are shrinking in size relative to everyone else. I mean, I have been kind of shocked at that part of, because what I've started to see in this current reactionary moment we in, everyone thought we were going to be fighting white nationalism, and what we're fighting now is jingoistic chauvinism. But there's a smart group of conservatives taking advantage of the fact that in this current period of breaking empire, where things are declining slowly, a whole lot of people, including a whole lot of Latino and Asian immigrants, who are now 2 or 3 generations in, are their sympathies with one side or the other of this debate between right reactionaries and black Democrats is beginning to wane. And so what you've seen is, for example, in the Newsom re-election, that was largely college-educated white people that re-elected Newsom in California. Most people set out to vote again. And you've also seen and I've seen it in person here in Salt Lake. There's the increase of Latino black tensions in local city politics. It's become, and not that there's a huge black population here, honestly, but it's become actually explicitly called out. We
were talking in the beginning about these vast world historical schemas, this developmental dynamic of capitalism and imperialism and whatever. And if we accept that we're in this period of turbulence and change, where one cycle is ending, where neoliberalism is exhausted and something new is coming into being, or maybe the end is coming into being. Maybe we're just done after this. Maybe Grossman's right. Maybe this is just the last crisis and we'll just settle into barbarism or something like that. But if you take all these things, which I think are very serious and very real, and you juxtapose them to what politics consists of in this country, it is laughable. It is a fucking disgrace and a tragedy. It's about CRT versus whatever the fuck, and attacking trans people and their rights. And then from the Democrats, of course, it's about a rearguard defense of it's sort of diversity capitalism project.
Right. Anything that's all inclusive in its amelioration is racist because it doesn't deal with one adjacent person. I don't think that it comes out totally out of CRT either, but we'll see more and more of this. You've seen
rhetorically anyway.
Well, you've seen the 1619 political project explicitly now has ADOS, African descendants of slave only clauses in some of its reparations movement, and also living wages for all people. It's a weird mix of things. One that we're not going to see any of. This is the thing, though. When people talk about why doesn't the working class embrace the social democratic or progressive project when they believe in its policies? And I'm like, well, you've never done them.
They're fucking depoliticized. This
Right.
country is completely depoliticized. You can go down to the job site and talk about all the fucking programs you want, but every motherfucker down there knows they're never gonna fucking get it. They're not gonna get it from the Democrats, and they're sure as not fucking to vote for like 20 fucking ding-dongs in a fucking smoky room somewhere deciding to build a new party.
I mean,
and
like,
they're right. You're
totally
not gonna build
right
it that
about that
way.
Right? It's like politics in this country is. I'm not gonna. I don't like the term PMC because I think it's an incoherent category, but it is basically, in non-Marxist terms, a middle class versus upper middle class discourse.
Yeah.
And what it to put it into Marxist terms or into class terms, what you have is the true bourgeois who seem absent. A group.
They're holding on for dear life.
Yeah, a group.
They're muddling through.
Right, a group of tech and governmental related rentier, and then people who service that. All right, like the academic institutions, certain kinds of professional institutions, etc. That sound like when the people say the PMC thesis like will include sometimes everybody with a college degree, which is ludicrous. But there are real workers in this category. This what makes this category weird. The top of this category, I don't think are workers, but there are real workers. They're not industrial proletariat, but there are real workers in this category. Then you have petite bourgeois and people aligned with that. All right, and think about their interests. Like these people are rentiers, taxes help them. These people have low profit margins. They don't think they can afford the taxes, and they're going to lose their and you saw this in the voting patterns actually.
Because the tax revolt of the 70s was a response to declining profits.
Right.
It was like a rational response on the part of the petty bourgeoisie and property owners as like things start to get squeezed to say, well, we got to get it back somewhere. Might as well be from the school system of California or whatever.
Right. We like this school system. It's actually good for free riding off of training, believe it or not. But we can't do this forever. I mean, this is what gets me is people seem to think this is all just about greed. And yes, greed's part of it. But for the petite bourgeois,
they're under threat.
Who do make up it is the petite bourgeois and a certain kind of labor elite in rural
aristocrats of labor like myself.
Right. Yeah. Right. In rural areas who tend to be Trumpists.
Mm-hmm.
They tend to look at their communities and see things are getting worse.
Which they are.
Which they objectively are.
Opiates being the big headline.
Opiates one, but I mean, just general, like there's no jobs.
Yeah. Health outcomes, life expectancy is declining. It's all there.
Right. Their children leave because there's nothing for them.
Yeah.
The JD Vance is. I mean, I make this joke like I could have been JD Vance if I had gone into the military and like had a senator get me, the JD Vance story, of course, is the one where he doesn't say that he got help from an Ohio state senator
to get into Yale.
Yeah, to get the advantages at Ohio State, and then get into Yale.
Okay.
And he got that by being just very lucky in his military placement because he was not in. He got what we call non-pog. So he was not a grunt. He was like non-officer military intelligence or something similar to that. Which I've had friends like I'm from Georgia. I have I've never been in the military, but I have deep ties to it because you don't where I'm from. You don't really. There's nothing else to do. Also, that's large parts of the United States.
Oh, yeah. My best friend out of high school, we both ended up working in factories for a couple of years, and he got the fuck out. I got out by going to state school. He got out by going into the military, and he's 22 years in right now, and he's working on an advanced degree. This is a guy that got C's and D's and barely made it through high school. It's a real thing.
That way, yeah. You and I have a similar background. Like your way out of where I lived was you got into a state school and then left, or you went back and became a teacher, which I did both. Or you went into the military. or you got very lucky and got one of the Geico or the production jobs. But the production jobs in the area, even though they came back, only tend to need 50 to 200 people around the entire factory.
Yeah.
So it's like
the elastomer factory I worked at was like that. Or you could do the alternate thing, which is go into state school, drop out, or whatever, then realize in your 30s, like, wait, my uncle's a carpenter and he's doing fucking great. Why don't I put my name in for an apprenticeship and say fuck academia, fuck all these white collar bullshit jobs that you hate anyways, and just be a labor aristocrat for the rest of your life. Have a retirement, have a defined benefit pension, for example.
But I do think one of the things, like the politically, this has led to like places like the DSA, they don't understand how the unions work because their ideas of unions are either teachers' unions and whatnots, which in urban areas can be radical, can engage in social unionizing, but that's not the way they work in most of the country. And what is not talked about is urban area union membership in non-closed stop states are low. Do you know why?
Right.
It's just expensive. It's not just right to work stuff. I'm in a right to work state. Union membership in the rural areas is high because local dues, the local end of the dues are low in rural areas, but to maintain a building in an urban area is too expensive. So the dues shoot up. So less and less teachers join unless it's a closed shop.
Like, I want to go back to, I think you're on an important point here about this sort of divide, the way, like the class composition of the United States, and there being these sort of this divide, this like bifurcation of it. So I think it's very similar to like Gabe Winant had this great book about the healthcare industry in Pittsburgh. I don't know if you read that, The Next Shift it's called. And basically what he posits, and I hadn't thought about this till I read it, was that one thing that the New Deal order creates, somewhat consciously actually, is it created like a two different tiers for being a worker in the United States. Right. It's part of the reason we don't have socialized medicine in the United States, and a lot of these other sort of subsidies to the wage fund, is because you had like an interior where you had a private welfare state. And you had like at a certain point, like 30-something% of American workers were inside this sort of productive union sphere, where they had all the benefits that they had in the Netherlands, but it was all through the union, provided by private capital, which was forced to bargain with the unions because of how things were. And then you had the vast exterior to that, where people who were working, shitty jobs in order to service those people within the interior, or working in government jobs outside of that, or people just kind of like in what's equivalent of the gig economy right now, odd jobs and shit like that. And what's happened is that interior has hollowed out, right? So that everybody now, by and large, lives the way that, like, say, a black domestic worker in the 1950s or 60s would vis-a-vis like a unionized industrial worker. I mean, those conditions have generalized, but then, and this is geographically situated too, you have this vast complex that you're talking about of like tech and media and education jobs, which represent like a completely different, I don't know, like world, basically.
Right. It's the expansion of credentialization. So we all feel like we've had to do something to get this. Like it's somehow meritocratic. And then it's interesting because if you compare this to the situation in the social democratic countries, what you see is similar developments actually for different reasons. But here it has created a kind of bifurcated class consciousness that mostly conservatives, and now a group of, we've seen a lot of socialists try to pick this up, but poorly. And then
pick up the PMC thesis?
Yeah, the PMC thesis and this, that, and the other. I mean, the PMC thesis was a left thesis, but it was actually supposed to explain what was going on with the baby boomers. That was Barbara Ehrenreich's goal. It's a combination of basically it's a combination of like three different class theories, kind of ad hoc. So it's
like a Burnham one, right?
It's James Burnham's in there explicitly. Yeah. That's why the M is in there. Then there's the professional administrative class theory of like people like the later Frankfurt School economist Frederick Pollock. And also,
that's an airplane or something, huh?
That is.
Or a truck.
It's airplane.
Oof. Good times to be a podcaster, huh? I hope you're not getting like 9/11, man. Are you in like a aircraft zone? Are you supposed to be?
I'm near an airport, but they're not generally that low.
Ooh. Well, I hope everything's okay. I'm sure it's fine. Is that another one? Is that a fighter jet trailing it?
Yeah, that's a jet.
Wait, did you see it?
Yeah.
So there's a jet trailing a passenger plane?
No, there's a jet trailing another jet. That's what I just saw.
Wow.
I was looking out the window.
All right, so the Air Force is doing maneuvers or something.
Yeah,
or we're in World War III now, and
who knows?
Signing off, folks.
Although, like, you would probably know before me because I live in Salt Lake and you live in New York. You're a bigger target.
If the feed gets cut, that's like a 10 gigaton bomb being dropped on New York City.
Yeah.
So long, folks.
What I've just found fascinating about this is we've now seen Striketober. Let's talk about the left response to Striketober because it was bad.
Yeah.
By the time
the left,
by the time the left realized it didn't happen for the most part. Like we did see major work actions across the country, particularly in healthcare, where things got pushed to the brink.
Things that initially arose with the lockdown.
Right.
You know, like this kind of tension building for the last year and a half. When again, was I talking about this pre-taping or after taping when we were talking about like the kind of quiet wildcat general strike?
A little bit of both,
when
yeah.
COVID hits, yeah.
So we saw that, and it finally hesitated when like things like Kaiser Permanente tried to increase their profit margin even more.
Mm-hmm. Non-profit Kaiser Permanente, which comes interestingly out of the Kaiser steel manufactory. It was their like private social democratic internal welfare way of keeping their workers healthy. And now the steel is gone and they're just a fucking hospital network. It's so axiomatic of how things have gone in the last like 100 years.
So yeah, so you have that push that you have the John Deere stuff. You had a lot of strikes. You also have the tensions around education, which have been what I find interesting right now is that for the past 30 years, the left, the cultural left, and we use our queer Marxists, have been winning almost every cultural debate. We're not anymore. Like if you're not in a major city.
If you're not at Evergreen College.
Right. Like I've heard CRT used more by conservatives, and they don't know what it is. I mean, and neither do the liberals defending it, frankly, because some of the stuff they say is also ludicrous. It's
and they're trying to deny something which is really real, which is that after the failure of the insurrection last year, of the rebellion last year, when real changes like defunding the police or radically changing it so that the police didn't just murder black people all the time and mass incarceration. Instead of that, you got critical pedagogy, you got D'Angelo's white fragility, you got, of course, like all the corporations being
stuff
BLM.
Been happening slowly for the past 2 decades,
but then ramped up as a sort of like counterinsurgency against like the proletarian elements of rebellion that existed like for that summer. And that's all we're left with now, because of course it's been the opposite of defund the police. Biden just signed a big bill to give more cops. So you have to now litigate this culture war because there's no ability, that we're at an impasse where there's no ability for the state.
I'm going to say something super controversial. Please. Defunding the police without abolishing them is stupid. I'm just going to say that outright. Because if they still have their social function and still have access to any funds, but they're no longer behest to the state to get them, they can do whatever the hell they want.
And there were people on like the whatever you want to call it, post left, and people in the right populists, like conservative nationalist people who are right that what you're going to do is you're going to open the door to private mercenaries on the streets, as like it's not like you're changing. Obviously, you're not changing the capitalist social relations, so something has to come into that vacuum in order to replace it, and it wouldn't necessarily be good. It'd probably be really bad.
Well, I mean, it's just. We've also seen actually the only crime we've seen an uptick in, actually not in property crime, it's been murder.
Yeah.
And at first, there was a decrease in murder during COVID, then it shot way up, but not in everywhere. And here's my response to conservatives when they talk about it. Oh, it's because of the defund police movement. Well, police only cleared 20% of murders in a lot of these places anyway.
Right.
So, and like 20% of murders is like, those are the people who come in and tell you that they did it. Like,
or they just gun somebody down, like their coworker, like at work.
Right. With a camera right there. like basically 20% clearance rate, you're better. That's odds are actually slightly less than randomly arresting the right person.
Right.
So I don't want to say the cops were doing anything, but something changed. So that now has been discredited amongst a lot of regular people of color. I'm not going to lie, and this is not something that the left.
Eric Adams is our mayor now. I know what you mean.
Right. And I'd also think the right is getting smart to playing off the class tensions within these minority groups.
Yeah. Within the Democratic coalition, really.
And they're breaking it up. So what's happening is the Democratic coalition has never made sense. The Democratic coalition has been, if you made less than $80,000 a year, for each, like, what is it, $1,000 less you made, you were more likely to vote Democrat. And if you made more than $200,000 a year and you weren't in the Sun Belt. Right. So basically,
there's like a donut hole there of like comfortable middle classes. Yeah.
So like middle class and petite bourgeois white people, like labor aristocrats and petite bourgeois people, yeah, okay, they were Republicans. And a lot, and then it's age and region based. So like, pensioning workers tend to be conservative because they're pensioning, they're no longer part of the active workforce, et cetera, et cetera. We can explain these things. I remember everybody pinching up, oh, this is like fascism. This is this weird fascist class college, Robert Evans.
No comment. I'm not a shit talker. I'm a gentle person. I critique ideas, not people.
I mean, the thing is, I thought some of this was interesting. That they were finally picking up on this. A lot of these liberal adjacent anarchists were picking up on this. But what I didn't realize was like, oh, but they're reading this wrong. They're reading this very wrong. Michael Lind and these like national conservatives actually have a better reading of what's going on. And they've been better pivoted to take advantage of it. The left, like, this should be, in all rights, this should have been our moment after Bernie.
Yes. Well, when we're talking about the failure of the left, whatever that even means anymore, I don't even know what that
I have
means.
No fucking idea.
Well, the failures of the left to like integrate or play any role whatsoever within this strike wave, man, that is a damning. It's an indictment on the left post Bernie Sanders, because everybody we're left with now. Instead of this Bernie Sanders moment, which had all of its problems or whatever, we're left with like these different cliques and sects now, some combination of like rad lib anarchists. You've got like bog standard social democrats who still think that they can enter into the Democratic Party when that's proven to be bankrupt as fuck. You have like neo-Stalinists. You've got Browderism is back now. You're like trying to do patriotic socialism in the United States. There was never, it seems to me, except for some elements of the DSA, and I give them credit, and what's left of the Trotskyists are almost gone now. There was no serious attempt to look back and say, well, this electoral strategy failed. Maybe we shouldn't just go and ape political theories from 100 years ago. Maybe we should realize that if there's one lever, if there's one missing piece to this project that we were supposedly trying to do on behalf of the working class, it was actually like integration of that into the working class itself. And you had, after Bernie, over a year between that and Striketober in order to play any role whatsoever and being part of like a relatively novel and exciting working class upsurge, and it was completely squandered.
You've seen Stalin. This is something that's haunted me. I read a book called Tyranny of Theory by Ron Tabor. That book's mixed. Some of its critiques of Marxism are dumb, some are not. But it did predict one thing accurately, and it did it in 2012. It said, after the end of the Occupy anarchist movement and that end of anarchism, we were going to see a rebirth of Marxism. But it was going to get frustrated and go into social democracy, and they get frustrated again and try to recapitulate Stalinism, but without any states that really support it. So it's going to,
Yeah, that's a good call there, bud.
and what happens after that is like degenerations into conspiracism, because you have to keep movements towards kinds of right populism. And I thought this fear was somewhat overstated for a long time, until, not because Jimmy Dore is one of these maddening figures when people are like, well, you agree with, and like Jimmy Dore, and I'm like, actually, when Jimmy Dore speaks about the Democrats, he's often correct.
Yeah,
like
he just has nothing. Out. He has nothing besides that. But yeah, you can be right about
like
that.
Well, what he wants is basically right populism with some kind of pink core, ultimately, and that's all. And he's very mad at the Democrats for legitimate reasons, to be frank.
Aren't we?
However, like what I mean, like the People's Party, that's the Green Party Part 2, and it's even less impressive.
Yeah.
Like, and so what do they do? Well, the other thing is, this is all a media thing, and that's his job, and so he's going to go where the money is, and we saw this with the history of Alternate. And I know that sounds strange, but Alternate was this liberal progressive.
You and me are the same age, so I'm
remember,
I'm
right?
on you. Yeah, of course I remember.
Yeah. Well, Gray Zone comes out of Alternate. And I don't see this to start crap. Not everything Gray Zone does is illegitimate. They're actually good on certain things about imperialism.
Oh, yeah.
But they were clearly chasing declining state funding sources for getting able to do good investigative journalism. Right? But that's why, like, I have no other explanation for why Max Blumenthal, for example, pivoted overnight on his theory coverage. Like... and
the vaccine thing too. Everybody with that's the huge culture war now, is the vaccine thing.
Picking up on the picking up anti-vax and anti-mask. Even when some of the mask points should be like, I really do wish the left would have something to say about the fact that clearly a lot of these politicians and elite do not actually follow the health guidelines in the liberal areas that they're trying to enforce on everyone. Of course.
Dude, we're at this crazy fucking point right now where rational, reasonable health policy, not just in the United States, mostly in the United States, but across the world too, is impossible, because what quickly happened in the 2-3 months after the pandemic started was that you had this dumb, ridiculous, powerful bifurcation of opinion on the plague, on the pandemic, that, because it's the United States, turns into a Republican and a Democrat
and frankly, both of them were wrong on stuff.
No, like, and that's what I wanted to say, is that and now we're at this point, a year and a half later, where the Pfizer has opened up the IP for this new therapeutic that's like 90% successful. It's now could be made generically, like 90% successful in keeping people out of the hospital. We've seen that the vaccines are simply not working in the way that they need to work in order to stamp out this disease. And we should be having right now, like in the media and amongst the ruling class, there should be a conversation right now about how to wind this thing down. Instead, we're stuck in the same fucking bullshit, like either complete lockdown or open up, that we've been having for the last year and a half, because there's this mass political impasse right now. We're in this like realignment crisis theory of American politics where real things can't even be talked about. Where remember when Biden was like the return of FDR?
I mean, it's maddening. It's maddening, and it's maddening how short these people's memory are, including some of the left commentators and again, we're not shit talkers here, but I have seen left commentators go from criticizing the center of the Democratic Party to supporting Biden and then getting rewarded for it, to like now picking up vaguely right populist talking points. The biggest one, I am going to name names, and I this is a person I know. Like, I have met this man. We have had dinner together. Like, Richard Wolff going on Jimmy Dore to say that even if I
took a class with Richard Wolff.
Yeah,
I was the class ultra. He did not like the things I was saying. This was like 12 years ago or something. Anyways, go on.
But Richard Wolff was on Jimmy Dore to talk about, even if it's not true that the left should be taking up some of these anti-vax mandate points. And I think the OSHA mandate's stupid. Not like, to be frank, not that we shouldn't have mandates. That's not my argument. I think like people saying, "Oh, it's clearly legal." I'm like, no, no, it's not clearly legal for the federal government to use a loophole in OSHA, which, by the
also,
way,
fuck OSHA. If you work in construction, like, you hate OSHA, man.
Right.
It's
also,
trash.
like when does OSHA ever enforce shit?
They've got 3 or 4 enforcement officers for like the metropolitan area of like over 10 million people.
So
the only time OSHA will ever show up on your job is if you're crushed by a fucking beam. They'll show up and like check the dead box on their form or whatever.
Right. And so I point this out to say, like, we've been gearing up for this. Just like, for example, on the Green, we're still going to be fighting over this and this Build Back Better program, and the progressives are dying on the carbon tax stuff. And I'm like, one, there's no evidence that carbon tax is going to work. What it's going to do is just increase prices on the lower end of purchasing. Two,
then you get some Jilly John shit.
Right. Well, right, exactly. And it's just like, two, like, you guys keep on saying you understand that these, like, the pipeline stuff and all this is going to cost jobs, but then you never deliver on the jobs promises to counteract it. So of course everybody hates them. Like,
look, the larger point here, and like, I've gone through, I think, a lot of thinking about things since Bernie succumbed to the Democrats, let's call it, since the Bernie movement proved out to be based on faulty principles, or at least to have failed on its own terms.
Yeah, people can apologize for all the shit they said about me for being right about Bernie.
They can apologize to me too if you want. You know, people were saying, why can't you get in the can for Bernie? And I gave them some good reasons, and I got a lot of shit for it. But
right. I figured Antifada was also in similar. I started listening to you around that time, and I'm like, no one else is saying Bernie. Like, I wasn't doing that whole ML, like, oh, Bernieism, blah, blah, blah. But I was just like, it's not going to do what you think it's going to do.
It's not going to. And you can't you can't return to social democracy. You can't just press the social democracy button.
Yeah.
Conditions are completely different.
But
like, when we go back to the strike shit that we were talking about, there, again, should have been an attempt to, like, I'm sorry, let me back up again. One of the things that I realized, and maybe this is an overreaction, maybe this is hyperbolic, but I don't give a fuck about anything Democrat anymore. I don't even look at it as like some sort of quasi sort of imminent political horizon, you know, that you can see in the inner workings of the Democrat Party. People tell me, oh, local elections, we can run as Democrat. Shut the I can't fucking do it anymore, because all people are doing is, once you dip a toe into those waters, all of a sudden you're dragged all the way under. You're dragged into this river and stream, this tide of fucking trash, which makes you ultimately neglect the really important shit, for example, that's happening like with Striketober, right? Which is that it's not simply that unions called a whole series of different strikes, that the union leadership said, oh, this seems like a good time to strike, our contract's up, let's go for it. In case after case after case after case, you had the rank and file of these unions forcing those unions, the union leaderships, to call strikes. 97% of workers going out for strike authorization, workers turning down contract after contract after contract that the union had bargained for them because it wasn't fucking good enough, and they were pissed off, and they went up against capital and their union leadership. You have, like, it's not just that there's a bunch of strikes right now, it's also that the working class, at least within unions and probably outside, because we see how many people are quitting their fucking jobs right now because they're fed up and pissed off. You have self-activity within the working class arising again in this particular moment, in this place and time. Workers militantly pushing against the bounds that they are tied in. This is part, again, of this turbulence and this reforming of something that we're seeing right now. And the left isn't part of it at all. In fact, people didn't even fucking know about it until it happened. Why are there not people on the ground? If you claim you're a communist or you're a socialist, why aren't you familiar with what's going on in the union contracts, within the working class, in your local area, and be able to report back to the rest of us so that we can get a picture for how the world fucking works that isn't one given to us by MSNBC or Fox News or the fucking Nation, because they sure as fuck aren't covering it.
The only thing that we heard from leftists was attempting to salt Amazon unionization. right? Which is I'm not shitting on that. I'm not saying that's not real. I'm it was, but like that was the only thing anyone was hearing about in left media. And then I started seeing like, I'm a union member. I'm a rep, actually. I'm not just a member. And I can go all day about how like I have no delusions about what unions are like.
Oh.
And I have friends that work on that. Another thing, this bugs me actually. Even though my friends who work on the other end, they're good people. Some of them are good leftists. Some of them conservatives. But how much dirt I get on what's going on in the unions, not even in my union, but from having to talk to the professional end, because the professional end and the member end, even if you're a rep, almost has a wall across it. So like, I'm not surprised that the left was blindsided about this, but they should have known the atmosphere of workers. And the reason why they don't, let's be fucking frank.
They're not oriented towards the working class.
Right. They're not
oriented towards Twitter.
Right. Exactly. They're not even oriented towards like professional class, really. Like, because that's the thesis. What they're oriented towards is the id of the chattering. Twitter, you and I both know, is where the chattering classes, by that I mean the media mostly.
Yep. And academics
goes to like popularize its ideas in a particularly stupid form.
Mm-hmm. And then other people are going to make fun of those ideas or pick them up.
But there is a social dynamic that is undeniable, that's different from what you see in Facebook, where Facebook siloing calls for these weird silos of bizarre beliefs. Twitter is unsiloed, but it allows for people with marginal ideas to feel like they have a whole lot more, because they don't know the nature of who their followers are. Mm-hmm. It's impossible. Like, I used to try to figure it out. I don't. I'm like,
I know who my favorite followers are, and those are communist construction workers, and I have a decent amount of them too. You guys, if you're out there, I love you guys. You guys are the best.
But when I look at Twitter, one of the things I saw is I've seen people totally ratioed and canceled, like for real canceled on Twitter, and it didn't transfer to not even other media forms. Mm-hmm. So it's like it's become its own world.
And it's fooled the left at large into believing that it is the world, that it has any influence whatsoever on what's happening on the shop floor at the John Deere factory in fucking Iowa. It doesn't matter. It's actually worse. It's worse than it doesn't matter, because it fools people into thinking that that's the thing that matters. And they're blindsided when 30 million workers, many of them fucking pissed off because of how they've been treated since this pandemic happened, walked off the job, quit their fucking jobs. And in 30% of those cases, didn't even have another job lined up. They just threw their apron in the boss's face and said, fuck you, and left.
There's all kinds of people ask me, why is there a labor shortage? I'm like, workers are quitting. Women left the workforce en masse for childcare.
Early retirements.
There's been a ton of people did not realize how old our labor force was. You've
had futurists and venture capitalists telling the American working class that all the trucking jobs are going to be automated in the next 2 to 3 years, and they say that every year, right? And so that it turns out, instead of self-driving trucks, which I'm sorry are never going to happen, you have a vast trucker shortage. People like truck drivers just don't exist, and the ones that do exist have been put into these fucking CDL mills, basically, that like people come out of it with $50,000 in debt after working 100 hours a week driving a truck for a year. So like the complete opposite of what we were told by the Economist or by Wired or whatever about how the job market was going to look. It's the complete opposite.
The futurists have been wrong about everything. Like the whole the online teaching was going to be like. I find it hilarious that online teaching like flipped who was for it and against it during COVID, like 100% flipped, 180. Because I think conservatives realized that their assault on childcare was also, their assault on public schools was actually predicated on them everybody not realizing that it was the only viable form of childcare.
How many women have dropped out of and men have dropped out of the workforce for lack of childcare?
Tons. And I know a whole lot of people who are trying to survive off one income now. I also think people weren't realizing how old the workforce was, because boomers, as much as we hate them, as much as they're the richest generation that's ever existed in the era, any working class boomer they also can't retire, particularly after 2007. So a lot of them, and they don't want to, because they don't trust things after 2007. Yeah. So a lot of them until now were basically planning on staying in the workforce till they died.
Yep. At least be a Walmart greeter in their 80s or whatever.
Right. So, well, I mean, that's like not even, those are even older than boomers. But yeah, so all those people are gone too now, because the cost benefit of dying of COVID really is.
Exactly.
So there's all that. I also think there is a theory that is applicable, and people don't like me talking about this because it sounds like I'm anti-immigrant, and I'm not. But that there were sectors where the immigrant workforce was used and celebrated by liberals for being used to keep prices down. That now that workforce is not available.
Meatpacking.
Yeah, meatpacking's a huge one. You know who works in meatpacking? Because my brother, who's an ex-felon, works in meatpacking for a while. And he got out of it after he almost lost his finger. Was immigrants and felons, like
the reserve army, right? Pull these people out, yeah.
And so, I mean, I'm sure there are some. I don't want to sound like I'm just over categorizing them or equating immigrants and felons or anything, but that's who I saw there.
No, like, and if you ever look into the history of the meatpacking industry, the reason why you have these vast industrialized factory floors, essentially, to produce meat and then refrigerate it and send it refrigerated to the cities was a capitalist efficiency. It was the massive increase of productivity because there were union fucking butchers in every city in this country who were like a logjam to fucking profitability. And so it was given the fucking like steel plant treatment, basically. And then as like the union jobs dissipate, as unions get smashed up, it becomes like the lowest of the low, but also like a relatively steady job where you can make a good butt for it. And but here's the thing, dude. Here's the thing. And I've been thinking about this a lot too. I know you're not done with the labor shortage thing, but like something that happened first with COVID and now with the supply chain and just-in-time production crisis, which we're living through, is that en masse working class labor has become visible again.
Yeah,
it's completely mystified and invisible in an economy where you can like swipe right and a commodity shows up at your door 2 days later, or you're going into the supermarket and you look down at the steak, it's already prepackaged. It's like it came like that off of the cow or whatever. Now, part of I think this workers' resurgence in the United States is because with COVID, we, the working class, became visible to ourselves again in a way that hadn't been true due to like the spectacular nature of the economy.
But we've become visible to ourselves in a way that does actually mirror some of InNo's predictions that our traditional ways of organizing are not effective. Like I think about like I'm waiting to find out the Burgerville finally got settled, right? The Great Portland, IWW service sectors, which
hell yeah,
union, but it's unclear if there's a no strike clause in it. Like I still haven't heard that for sure. I think there probably is.
I bet the modern IWW wouldn't really have a choice except to do a no strike clause, right? We'll see.
Well, we'll see, because I know that they forbid their laws forbid it, which would mean that the union with the IWW would have to disaffiliate with the IWW National, and that'll look really bad. But my point is though, like, here's one thing that we have to deal with. Not only do we have the stuff with unions, let's talk about the real labor thing here. Manufacturing's been having a crisis for this entire time, and people are quitting en masse. But you know what you're not seeing? You're not seeing an increase in the raw numbers of unionization. You know what you actually saw? Union percentage went up to like 9 or something, but only because so many people got laid off in the beginning. And now, as they're starting back up, they're not starting in the union jobs. So despite all this, we have to admit that the workers still don't really totally trust the unions right now.
No. Yeah, I mean that's part of that rank and file upsurge I was talking about before. Is it any surprise after the history of the UAW and 30 fucking years of concessionary contracts while the fucking union leadership drives around in limos making $500,000 a year, no matter how shitty the third or fourth or fifth tier is there any surprise that these people are going against their leadership and basically like turning down contracts? Of course it isn't. American workers got this is like haram. I can't believe I'm going to be saying there's a lot of people out there are going to be like, oh, I can't believe he said this about U.S. unions. There's no fucking labor movement. Anybody who calls it a movement is a fucking shill. It's a series of decaying and dead institutions that are business unions for the purpose of brokering labor power collectively. And to the extent that they are powerful, it's because they exist within the bonds of a system that was always meant to bind the working class within the capital labor fucking relationship in a subordinate status.
What the most union money that wasn't, I mean, dues can't go to this, but what the most, almost every ounce of union money for the past 50 years, like 90, I think it's like 90% of its non-dues based budget has gone into lobbying Democrats. And for fucking what?
There basically are the Democrats. For all intents and purposes, they are part of the Democrat apparatus.
Right. And they haven't done anything about the Democrats screwing labor over and over and over again. And yes, the Democrats have finally sort of made talking points to stop that. They're no longer doing it explicitly anymore. But
it's a dying part of the coalition. And Democrats have known that for a long fucking
time. That's why they haven't banked on it.
No, of course not.
They know it's a dying part of the coalition. And I'm tired of people like positing false consciousness or whatever for why workers don't like unions, and I'm like, no. I personally, as you know, a believer in labor, think it is my duty to be in my union and advocate for my people. However, you know, my people be my coworkers. Mm-hmm. However, I'm a public sector worker for one thing, and for another. And I'm kind of a labor aristocratic public sector worker, if I'm completely honest. And for another issue is I have to tell my union to screw off all the time.
People are very naive about unions. When I was talking shit about the UAW during the John Deere strike, for things that anybody should know. You know, for all the reasons that we're talking about, and the corruption scandal they had, people pushed back with me on Twitter, like, now is not the time to be attacking the United Auto Workers.
Yeah, I've always.
How naive are you? You think that the workers are coterminous with the union, that they have the same interests?
I was talking about the United Auto Workers Union in 2007 and how bad they fucked up and screwing over their younger members for decades, and that was part of how they could get totally screwed in the settlements that basically finished them off. You know, and why people like my brother and my stepfather, both of whom are directly related to the auto industry and have been workers their entire, well, one is now a professional, the other has been a worker their entire life, hates them like passionately.
There's people I have one of the strongest private sector unions that exist, and there's a lot of animus towards the fucking union. Of course there is. And look, this, like, when we talk about the problem with American unions, it's not because the bureaucrats are craven. It's not because they're greedy or corrupt or whatever. No, it's not because they've made the choice even to ally with the Democratic Party and put all their eggs in this legalistic policy basket, right? That is highly historically determined. And the reasons go back to the 1970s, the 1940s, and the 1930s, right? Yeah. But so why
from the New Deal forward, it's actually a part of. I mean, what we didn't finish this, and I was bringing this back earlier because we've been kind of, but like the Popular Front ended the ability, is what began the Democrats able to absorb the unions and absorb the labor movement, and that was almost a death knell for the American. Like it was also increase. I mean, we always make a joke about how the SPUSA until like maybe the last 3 years has basically just endorsed the worst parts of the Democrats because it's part of its Popular Front strategy and has been
CPUSA.
Yeah, CPUSA. Excuse me. It's part of its Popular Front strategy and has been forever. Like, but that really starts in 1930.
Workerism.
Yeah,
100%.
And it's funny that that the CPUSA is finally learning from that after almost 100 years.
They're fucking pushing back against the entryism of the patriotic socialists. I don't know if you follow that.
Yeah,
but,
I saw that. It was hilarious.
Really interesting. Very, very interesting.
Well, the funny thing about the patriotic socialists is some of them I've known to have I'm not going to name names, but this individual showed up at a conference with Alexander Dugin, and people were shocked. But I actually, because I was part of the right and even had no people in that part of the right, I knew that they had connections 2 years before that happened. One thing I will tell you is Red Brownism is this thing on Twitter that's often used to shout people down, and maybe even like the Alex Reed Ross scandal was hilarious because like that was kind of predictable. But one thing I will say is it's not unreal, and
it's not based on some sort of like abstract fallacy. Like the thing that they're right about is that the American working class is not attracted to the left.
No,
they're not attracted to communism. So what the patriotic socialist then says is that we need to go back to like Marxist Leninism of the 1930s, 40s, and 50s in order to like relate ourselves to an American working class which is still patriotic. And so you can argue with where they go with that and their practical prescriptions for it, but you can't argue that they're wrong.
Well, I mean, what is hilarious about that?
Aren't interested in communism. Of course, that's true.
That deviation in the Third International after the end of the Third International is really a reversion back to what killed the social democratic movement in the 1910s. I mean, if I say, I mean, killed it literally.
You know a lot more of this stuff than I do.
Like, this is the time period that I'm really most interested in, because even economically, because also from classical Marxist analysis, I don't think Grossman was being unfair. I don't know that there was ever a totally clear final breakdown theory in Marx, but I think Grossman was right that from the logic of everything we had seen, including the profitability crisis, is that you've seen that basically what led up to World War II should have ended capitalism. What people underestimated was the destructive, like both imperialism and the destructive capacity created afterwards.
I was having this conversation with Matt Christman the other day, and he said basically what saved capitalism was the United States.
Yeah,
was this like this still infinite zone of like extensive and intensive accumulation that existed outside the destruction of that war that could then again become this hegemon and this driver, of accumulation.
And that was how the United States was able to not have a bunch of crises in its transition to fully developed capital too, is because it had a place to dump all its overproduction. Like,
and it had its ready-made imperial sphere that it had since the 1830s.
It inherited. It didn't have to bleed for it. Like that, we bled in quotation marks for carving out our sphere of influence. Kind of like we get pissed off about China and Russia doing now. Not to defend China and Russia, but that's what they're doing.
Oh yeah.
And more Russia than China, to be frank.
And France. Yeah. France is doing the same thing in West Africa right now.
It's traditional. It's traditional for the last 200 years spiel of imperial influence, right? Yeah. When I learned in my 20s, even as a conservative, there were national governments in West Africa paying France money. I was like, that's absurd.
The Haitians paid, I think, until the Haitian state, I think, was paying back the French for all the slaves that had been freed up until like the 20th century as well. It's incredible stuff.
Yeah, it's so when you know this, you can kind of see the kind of impasse that we're at. But why has the left gotten to the way it is? And I a lot of times we blame the left as if it's just a problem of betrayal or if it's purely professionals. There's like the DSA has a bunch of real workers in it. I'm not gonna lie. I mean, like
there's some in my union. There's some in the carpenters union. Yeah.
The other thing that happened is the Trotskyist organizations, with the exception of the IMT and the most wild ends of the Sparts, they all liquidated.
Yeah.
Like, okay, the ISO had its own reasons, which was its own scandal. But like, and what's funny is that, but here's what people haven't noticed because we're American centric. The Trots have been doing this everywhere.
Except Argentina, where they're the third largest party in government.
Right. but
But
like
that's very specific to Argentina.
But like, if you look at like the Trotskyists around the world, they're actually all their organizations are in decline, with the exception of like some marginal ones like the IMT that have grown based off of probably the decline of other Trotskyist groups, because they're like the only game in town now. What does that mean? Like what? Well, one of the things that I've been fascinated with is like we've also seen Maoism die, like real Mao. When I say real Maoism, but like
70s style new communist movement.
Yeah, 70s style new communist, anti-revisionist Maoism that became.
I should add also some members of my union leadership are old industrializers from the Maoist point in time. They're still around.
Right. What's hilarious is those, like, if you look at what happened to the radical Maoists in California, they became Gene Kwan, the mayor of San Francisco. So like, they just became Democrats over time.
It became Van, whatever the fuck.
Van Jones. Like,
Van Jones, yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, became Democrats.
Right. I mean, you know, Rob Reich had a relationship to the RCP through the SDS. I just want to point that out. So like when people are like, oh, those are trots, because no, all of them did. All of them, and no one asked. And they're still not asking, because we're going to see it again. Yeah, sure. Our generation, me and you are both are like with that millennial Gen X borderline, and the Gen Xers are all reactionaries but I've always said, like, to defend Gen X, think about why. Like,
of course,
the Soviet Union
80s.
failed. Yeah. The 80s happened. Yeah. The Democrats pivoted hard, neoliberal. Like,
give
the
people
unions
a break, man.
Sucked. Like, of course they're reactionary. Why do you have, like...
The Gen X has made history, but not under conditions of its own choosing.
Right. So, like also grew up with conspiracy media back before we realized it was ever going to be politicized. Like,
and their one big shot, which was alter globalization and the anti-WTO shit of the 1990s, was crushed by 9/11.
Yeah, it was, and I was part. I was part of that. Like, I remember, I
saw it happen in real time.
It made me a conservative. I've talked about this many times, but like going from my first real political moment that wasn't like me hanging out with Gerda squat punks as a kid, and then accidentally for real ending up homeless. But then going out to, well, right before then going out to 98, doing a bunch of kind of illegal physical labor to make money to travel out to the protest as part of zine culture. Like, that's what I did.
You were at Seattle in 99?
I was there.
Wow. Okay.
That was my only, and I was like 19. I didn't know what the fuck I was doing. I wasn't even 19 yet. I was 18. And like when they started chaining each other there and bank chains, so like I was like, this is dumb. I don't like, that was my response, because I had no idea what I was going into. Okay, so what's funny is people saw that at the time, they saw it as a victory because of the G8 dissemination, some stuff didn't happen. But then I've always taken it as an utter failure, because 9/11 happened, then I went to Sea Island, which is where the next round of G something talks were happening in globalization.
GTAA or whatever.
Yeah. And nobody was there except for a bunch of libertarians and some weirdos from International Answer. Like, that was it.
Which is the Stalinists, right? That's the answer.
Well, I mean, they weren't Stalinists.
Okay.
They were trots back then, because the WWP and the PSL were trots. The Marxites, I mean, it's hilarious.
Look, if you're gonna do trot spotting, just have Andy back on. He's the best at this shit. He can give you the genealogy.
I screw up every now and then between Salt Australia and Salt America, because Salt Australia is Cliffite and Salt America is the militant.
I was close with Paul Maddock Jr. for some time. I haven't seen him in a bit, but he was a friend, and we kind of, orbited around each other. And he showed me this amazing graph, this chart, this flow chart of all the different splits of Maoist groups in the 1960s and 70s. And there's the Revolutionary Workers Party of Workers. There's the Labor Party for Workers of America Workers, the MLM or whatever. And he found out at the end that it was the same 7 or 8 people that had just branched out into all these different sectarian organizations based on splits over campism or whatever the fuck.
Yeah, because people think it's only Trotskyists to do that, but if you go back to the 70s. But my point is, what we're seeing right now is something similar, where we're going to see a lot of leftists. They're going to dissipate I think a lot of them are dissipating conspiracy culture, which is what happened to a lot of the Gen X left. People forget this, but what happened to the Gen X left after 9/11 eclipses the ultra-globalization movement is they became truthers.
Yeah.
And a lot of them became right-wingers through that movement.
Right. Yeah.
So there's that. We're going to see a lot of people I guess the thing is, though, it's hard to see who's going to find the Democrats attractive. I mean, obviously a large part of the DSA does, but then you have the fact that there's a massive media grift. I mean, calling it a grift is actually wrong. I call it a grift because it's a way that people are making money. That implies that they're fooling people. I think most of the people involved actually believe what they say.
Oh, so, if you're talking about the podcast and like left,
the podcast,
sphere,
100%. But also like the publication sphere, like all of it. They're so like it's not actually in the grand scheme of even the media market. There's not a lot of money, but
it's enough to. It's like the Die Linke in Germany, which is like a small political party, but is able to get matching funds from the state, so they can fund all sorts of shit all over Germany, and like enough leftists and activists can live off of it that it becomes its sort of own internal economy, essentially.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you know,
but you have that with the DSA, and you have that with like whatever like atomized leftists there are throughout the country.
Well, I mean, how long is it going to take Jacob to become Mother Jones?
Ask Boskar, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, like, because it's basically Boskar's conscience. I mean, and literally maybe Boskar's conscience that keeps it from doing so now. Like,
I'm friends with Boskar. I mean, me and him have hung out socially many, many times, and he truly believes. Like, you can say a lot of things about him, but he's not like big money, cynical.
He's a social democratic.
He's a Vivek
Marxist.
Yeah, he's a Vivek Chibarite, which is like a real tendency. And I know Vivek Chibber too. This isn't people trying to fucking make some filthy lucre off of having socialist magazines. It's people who truly believe it and found a media niche, a sphere where they could like publish things. And
but this is where like cynicism without personal denial or like personal denunciations is really important. Like, because there is a sense, and I know this from my own role in this, like. I worked for Zero. I saw Doug Lane. Doug Lane really believed and still believes that if he could ride the cultural niches, he could sneak in some Marxism to make Marxism more popular. And for a little while, he seemed to be successful doing it. Jacobin is that on like 10 times the scale.
Oh, big time. It's all like the socialist lessons of the spaghetti Western or whatever.
Right. And so what you see there is like, I don't think Mother Jones started out as a cynical progressive grad either. It came out of the same sort of tradition in regards to labor. It's just what is it going to do, and how's it going to get funded, and where's the audience going to go? And a true, a Vivek Chibarite, Austro-Marxist social democrat. And I actually have Austro-Marxist sympathies, and for my listeners who don't know what that is, that's the people who like thought that neither response to the conflicts between social democracy and the emergent communists were actually good. They also had interesting answers about culture and respecting cultural differences, but never making that like. There's a whole thing. There's a whole long theory of.
I'm interested. I'm not familiar with that stuff.
You need to if you start with Otto Bauer, the early Frankfurt School, not the Adorno Horkheimer Frankfurt School, but the
Pollock and
Pollock, Grossman, and the people of the 40s. They were all Austro-Marxist. Pollock kind of moved away from Austro-Marxism, but that's where they all started.
To be honest, I only know about this stuff from listening to you. I mean, it's all very interesting.
But these tendencies, though, I think there's a tendency to overemphasize the importance of these tendencies, right? I am a kind of a council communist with a background in post-Trotskyism, blah blah. But like, what actually drove me to this at these time periods were conditions that were not in my control, like. I did pick between the options available at the time, and the options available before Occupy were like Chomsky anarchism, crime think anarchism.
Partially me too.
I almost got in a fight with a crime think anarchist during Occupy. We'll talk about that another time. Cliffite or Grantite Trotskyism, really, really like anti-Chinese Maoism, which are people like, what? I'm like, before 2016, Dungism was remarkably unpopular in the U.S. left.
Oh my God, I remember. Yeah, it was shocking to see it return with such a vengeance. It returns. All right, I'm gonna probably piss people off with this shit, but it comes out of despair. Like I got a DM from this one guy. He was like a Red Sales dude. I don't know if you know redsales.org. They're like,
yeah, I know who they are.
Yeah, where he basically like dressed me down. He said, "There's no revolutionary potential whatsoever of the working class in the capitalist core, in like settler colonial the United States or imperial Europe. There's no chance of it. So why do you stress yourself out, man? President Xi has it under control. Just kind of like allow yourself to feel the power of Chinese communism. They're going to do all the work for you. Just stop stressing so much and let the Marxists within the Communist Party of China build socialism. It's cool, dude." And that's and honestly, as I'm reading it, I'm like, that's probably a good idea. A lot less stress, a lot less thinking and pondering about the world than I have right now.
Yeah, but then you have to explain all the labor actions against the Chinese government.
No. You have to. The mass wildcat strike wave, you have to completely ignore that. The hukou system of like labor passes and all the class struggle that exists between the rural.
The hukou system.
Ignore all that stuff and just say, save us, President Xi. And it'll be so much better for your mental health. And it's true.
Yeah, my friend Jean Bajelon, who's actually social democrat adjacent, actually said the same thing, that Xiism is just like FDRism. It's essentially a sign of giving up. Yeah. And I think I had a left communist friend who was a co-editor for me at North Star, became an editor of Resurgent magazine. He became like a hardcore, he became a hardcore Dungist for a while before it was actually popular. Because he said, like, look, I have to believe that communism is possible, and believe that communism is possible. I must believe that there's a communist state in the world. There's only one, ipso facto. Like, and I'm like, this is really dumb logic, but I get where you're coming from because you're despairing.
Yeah.
Right.
100%.
Like, and then, what it's interesting when you meet Marxists who spend a lot of time in China, a lot of them become reactionaries.
Not Zhuang, but the other ones, yeah.
No, I was talking to Kazaguaz, as just centrist China reporter who has some left sympathies and is also not unfair to China at all. Mm-hmm. Like his goal is for like the top between the U.S. and China and for both, but he doesn't think that's possible anymore.
Remains to be seen, but if one good thing that the Dengists and Xiists do is they're right that we should be helping to, as Americans, ratchet down the tensions between China and the United States. Exactly. I agree. I try to do the same thing.
It would put you in a weird situation where you're like, okay, China is it's at least 60% capitalist. What if you want to put a meaningless number on it? And yet you're also like, but like we need to ramp down this stuff with China and the United States. It's not good for anybody. In fact, with the climate crisis, it's world ending. Like, frankly,
yep.
Like, so, it's something where like, I don't like, but their politics seems to be fading too, even like really quickly. Like these cycles post Bernie, and I might name this episode actually after my friend Maxximilian Seijo over there at Superstructure Podcast talking about the specters of Bernie. Because in some ways, I do think that what we're seeing with the left right now and this inability to cope with reality is actually this. It's a fact that a whole lot of people got politicized in a time that they forgot the conditions of what the U.S. has been. And then and then they also got into this Bonapartist frenzy, but not in a time where Bonapartism was even remotely. Because I just remember telling people, like, even if Bernie wins, what's he gonna do?
I was saying the same thing. I was saying the same thing. I always with Bernie, I knew like the gambit was an upside down one, that you could use a political movement in order to create a class movement. I mean, that was basically what, the people who were serious about Bernie actually changing things, like the non-FDRites, were like, well, Bernie will get in and then he will, like, using his bully pulpit and maybe some, like, executive orders, maybe a bill that could be passed, which is unlikely, but basically use that in order to, like, convince the working class to start fighting for itself, to, like, create from top
Right.
down, a working
Which
class
isn't-
movement. And that's not out of the realm of possibility, but you can't imagine that Bernie's going to be able to go in at this late date and institute FDR style or Scandinavian style social democracy, which was always the kind of political horizon of most of these people anyways.
Well, it was funny because I was like, what you guys are basically arguing is not like, is the old French Marxists, like we're going to, and actually sometimes even the ISO, we're going to push for a lot of liberal reforms that we think are going to fail to hide the contradictions. And like, I'm always like, Marx says, this is the only strategy that I have a quote from Marx against, that like the working class will never trust you if you do that. If you advocate for a reform, believe in the reform. Like, because if it's like, oh, we knew it was going to fail the whole time, people will be like, then why did you get us involved?
Yeah. Why'd you bother us? Leave us alone.
Like, we could have been desperately disappointed on our own. Like, we didn't need you for that.
Right.
And also it shows that you don't have faith in us because you wouldn't tell us what the odds really were. And that's been like, that's kind of my stance on like this is when I fight with MMTers, they talk about the most progressive thing they have actually would be amazingly progressive, which is the full employment guarantee, but which is something like you barely have in even like socialist countries.
Yeah, full employment was a disaster for the capitalist class. You know,
right.
even the bullshit like Federal Reserve interest rate one that we had, you know,
right. But if you really think about this, that's like the classical Marxist opposition to such schemas actually makes sense, because the state is eventually you're going to hit your productive capacity limit and you're going to have rapid inflation, and it's going to discredit you.
Then you'll have a socialist state doing a Volcker shock.
Right, which happened in the 1920s actually in Germany.
Oh, really?
Like, so what people don't know is Shaktism, which was the monetary theory of what became the monetary of fascists, even though Hitlerists don't use it. They actually do something else. But was the print money theory kind of proto-MTT, because Chartalism was part of the Lassallean program too. And it got picked up kind of by the right in Germany. That led to the hyperinflation kind of. The people who ended up fighting inflation and also fighting labor were the SPD. And they were fighting labor because they thought that if you could encourage monopoly development, you could just seize the capitalist firms, and then you had the socialist structure there.
Right.
And they started fighting inflation because, and so it just looked like they were the people like Hilferding and whatnot who were actually suppressing the working class, while also developing their own like professional core that was huge. Like, and so that, like, most of labor did not side with the Nazis, but there is a sense that even though the SPD still controlled the majority of the labor vote, a lot of it kind of sat on its hands during that crisis.
I mean, what, like, the broader question of like wither the left, I guess, right, is like, I think that I'm not like an anti-leftist per se, but I don't think that the left, as it's used colloquially, is even really relevant anymore, because what the left always presumed, going back to the 1930s and before in the United States, going back to the 1890s, is that there's some sort of like cohesion of interest between communists and like progressives. And I think that was like, there was a historical moment where that was true to an extent up until the 1970s, but I think it's long since been dead in the water that we should be tailing Democrats and progressives, that we should be coalitioning with them, that if you're serious about communism, you need to keep involved in like, you know, political projects that are completely, and discourses which are completely alien to the actual like class itself. I think that like the only serious people, right, are the people out there right now saying that what we need to do is what we always should have been doing, which is orienting ourselves towards the actual, really, truly existing working class in the communities and workplaces in which they live and we live. And instead of doing this spectacular sort of like abstract politics about culture stuff and winning people over on like various different minute policy points of their own like miserable fucking lives. Instead, like, at least for now, dissolve yourself into the class. You know, there's nowhere else to be looking right now. And fortunately now, why this shit's so exciting since COVID happened, that's a fucked up way to say it, is that you're starting to see working class self-activity again. So it's not like you just need to get a shitty union job like you would 20 years ago and manage workers. You actually have something that looks like an embryonic militant class movement that could be rising in this country. Don't you want to hitch your fucking cart to that? Don't you want to be a part of that? Or are you ensconced in your fucking Excel spreadsheet job in order to like deign to go down and listen to, let alone join people who are like literally, as we speak, struggling against capital, against their union, and against the state?
One thing I would say to add to that is what I think you can easily misconstrue these points as opposed left or anti-left points. Where like we need to tail workerists. I don't think you tail. Like I go to my job every day, and admittedly I have an kind of elite job. People actually kind of know my politics are nuts. Like I'm sketchy about it at first until I have a personal relationship, so they don't think I'm a total weirdo. But like I don't hide my politics particularly, except for my students. And I have like I think that approach has worked way better than me trying to like, oh, I'm going to tell people what I think they want to believe, like, which is the right populist thing. But I do think there's a lot of stuff.
Or to incrementally drag people over by using Democrat talking points, as though
Right.
somebody has to buy into the Democratic cultural and political program in order to be a working class militant and be militated against the capitalists. It's absolutely untrue, and thinking that fucks you up.
Well, I mean, this. I'll give you an example of this on sexuality issues. Both sides of this question tend to take the wrong stance. One is like, I'll explain like why I got mad at Doug Lane about Jade Seprell, because I was like, okay, you're picking up talking points that right now are tending right wing, and also, you know, whether you're turfy or not, and that's I actually can't know your soul. I know Doug really well, but it's. The entire debate, the fact that you thought it was important to fall into a media debate about this, is absurd to me. Like, yes, people are alienated by canceling, and yes, that's why the right has been able to make such hay out of it. But let's also be real for a second. Like, that's a media discourse. It doesn't affect most people. And a great majority of people, other than the fear that they might be censored for something they say accidentally, don't care.
Don't give a fuck.
Right. They just don't care.
They don't give a fuck. I'll tell you, I'm in heavy construction. I'm in the aristocracy of labor. I'm in a conservative trade union. I'm in the white working class, like, I don't know, world that people imagine fucking exists. And there's maybe on a given job within your gang, maybe one guy who's like a big Trumpist and it goes on about like BLM and trans things or whatever. But by and large, people are like, yeah, okay, whatever. They're like rolling eyes at like the weird, you know, culture warrior political guy, because people don't really give a fuck. It's something that people with like the time and the energy and the sort of inclinations can get attached to, but in a way that has no bearing whatsoever on their lives or the people around them. And so, but then to assume that this like minority of people, what is it, like the 35% of actual voters who are pro-Trump, which when you break down what like the actual voters are into like the actual population, and then into like, you know, whatever, it's vanishingly like, small. It's like 15%, 20% of the
20% of the population.
And then of those who are actually working class as opposed to petty bourgeois, right?
It's going to be like 20, 30% of that. Like, it's like,
and then to tail these fucking people and say, and to like reify the working class to be these fucking people, you do yourself a huge disservice. And entering into that conversation, you end up on terrain that is not advantageous or even pertinent much to the communist project. And to like the beginnings of a serious communist project, which would be to cohere the very real and atomized instances of self-activity on the part of the working class in this country, which the job of a communist to begin with is to cohere and bring together into something more than like some ephemeral fucking
I'm going to say
strike.
something that's going to make people really uncomfortable.
I love when you do that, please.
But like the history of fascism in Italy is the history of actually ultras, not even because Mussolini was closer to the
left wing of the
left
Socialist
wing
Party,
of the Socialist Party, trying to tell what they thought were conservative attitudes amongst the working class. That led to Mussolini taking a defeatist position in World War One, then fighting in World War One under a position of defeatism, which is wild. Like we're to fight in World War One so that we'll try to have an empire which will destroy Italy. And then because of the war and because of his investment in the war, and because of tailing what he saw as the conservative attitudes of the working class of his quote proletarian nation unquote,
right?
His language.
Yeah. He ends up inventing fascism.
He ends up inventing fascism by taking conservative elements over and then vitalizing them.
Right. Well, he doesn't invent it. He picks up on strains that went back to the anarchist movement in France.
Right. He picks up on the Circuit Perdue and Surrealism, and also, but he does. I mean, and then also the conservative revolutionary movement does become involved. And you're like conservative. Yeah, it was a thing. It was in France. It's a national revolutionary thing.
So what you're saying is that tailism leads to maybe bad things.
Yeah, it leads to very bad. I mean, it's one of the funniest times right now. When I say funny, I mean dark. Like during the Trump period, everyone's like, "We have a fascist," and I'm like, "No, you don't. Like, you really don't. Like, there's some post-fascist elements in there. Yes, that's true. There are neo-Nazis involved. They're a very small part of that, but yes, it's true." But you don't have a mass fascist movement. But now I don't think it'll be a fascist movement, but I do think there's a new reactionary movement on the horizon that may be a lot more serious than Trumpism ever was. And
they're again like the old, they're not going to become wrapped in a Nazi flag. There's enough blood and degradation on the American flag for serious revolutionary reactionaries to use that flag in order to bring about horrific changes.
And I don't think it'll just be white either. Like this is the part that I think is most that I'm like, look, there's a petty bourgeois of color in this country, actually, ironically, partly because of racism, because they were shut out of normal salaried jobs.
Yeah, and normal credit and capital, yeah.
Right, but they've become a more and more important part of this economy, and if they've survived COVID, they've gained power. So their attitude towards a lot of social programs are going to change. And I think you're going to start seeing that. Not that, I mean, it's the thing. Like, we don't have, what are you going to judge this on? Like, what, because you're like, well, they don't vote Democrat. Well, I don't really care that they vote Democrat. What I care about is that in their lieu of not voting Democrat, that they're becoming reactionary voters or are willing to vote for reactionaries. Yeah. And if they're voting at all, I don't see how they're not.
Like, no, I mean, always classical Marxist theory, like to the extent that the petty bourgeoisie plays any role in a historical struggle, it's by vacillating between two poles of society. If there's no strong antagonistic working class movement to draw these people into their orbit politically and socially, then of course it's going to go to
they go into
side.
Authoritarian movements.
Why wouldn't they? It's in their class interest too.
Right. So, they need someone to try to freeze the economic society. Like they need a strongman to come in and decomplicate this decaying system, but also do so
and shore up their particular petty private property against a lot of this populism shit is about protecting petty bourgeois private property against the degradation of globalist international capital. It's back to that Postone essay about National Socialism and the value form and shit. Like classic. But I'm sorry. We spend a lot of time, not just you and me. I mean, we writ large talk a lot about incipient fascism, what Trump meant in that, the dark storm clouds that we see on the horizon of like a newly
revitalized. Not even the dark storm cloud that I'm worried about, if I'm completely honest with you. Even if there was a real
exterminism or something,
no, what I'm worried about is I tend to think, I'm going to say this, like, I tend to think that climate alarmism has made people miss how utterly catastrophic this is really being.
Yeah,
like
I
the
agree.
feedback systems are way worse.
Yeah, I think so too.
And that as this, like, I do take the psychological research that stress is a conservatizing force, and as the stress increases on these fracture areas, you're going to see new kinds of weird conservative movements pop up that you're just not. We aren't going to know what they are.
Now,
I would have not predicted.
QAnon is going to seem very mild, probably, compared to some of the shit people come up with. Well, so this is what I'm saying. We talk a lot about this because it's very real, and obviously, like, people on the left have to imagine they have a worthy enemy. Not like the Democrats. They don't seem like a worthy enough enemy. You need to create a white nationalist movement. So so we spent a lot of time talking about how much time does anybody on the so-called left spend talking about, you know, the tasks and the historical tasks of the socialist movement and integrating itself into like a strong working class, you know, counter tendency to all this. Because without the counter tendency, without a social force antagonistic to all of these crazy, scary, reactionary things, we're just going to slowly slip and slide into that horror world, just like in the 1970s, you know, when it was easy. It was the easiest for like the ruling class to just attack the working class. Now we don't even have a working class to stand up for democratic norms, or to stand up for social programs, or to stand up for like the very real and important cultural rights that people have in this country. It's going to be bad, and we should be spending a lot more time, I would argue, focusing on like our historical tasks and what we want to build and how to build it, than to fear monger about something that like we're not doing anything about.
Well, ironically, right? I mean, I guess my point is like the more we fear monger about this stuff, the more we're actually creating. When I say we, I don't mean that like, oh, we are actively somehow making these fascist movements real, but we're not.
We know fascist movements need the antagonism of the left in order to rise, and reactionaries have basically invented this CRT and trans, I don't know, whatever the fuck trans people are coming to like sexually assault people and whatever. They've created this in order to have an opponent worthy of how reactionary a program they have. They're calling Biden a communist because they have to, because there's no decent left for them to actually attack.
Yeah, that's totally true. And one thing I would add to that is the left's the liberal left's response to this has been to double down on its talking points and then miss when one of its talking points screw up. The big one is the Virginia case, where there was someone who took advantage of trans bathroom laws and actually raped 2 girls. And then the school board looked like it was just in denial that it even happened. Now, school boards hide rape all the time. I'm like, that's kind of like, so that's not new, but like, and it's statistically almost ephemeral that it happened. It'll probably like, but the thing is, when leftists double down on stats like that, and then I'm like, all it takes is one counterexample for that to rhetorically not work. And that one counterexample in the infiniteness of time is almost inevitably going to happen.
Yeah, of course.
So it's just like you need to change your but we're not like.
But this is
my influence the sexual on this sexual gender generalized stuff is I'm like it hasn't. I mean, for good and ill, it hasn't fundamentally actually changed a whole lot of people's lives. So like, we like, so on this issue, I'm like, well, we have to like, catering to people's bigotry isn't going to help anybody, nobody at all.
No.
But I do think we have to admit that, like, to people who are not activated to protect really marginalized groups, and that's a lot of people, frankly.
Mm-hmm.
It looks like we're going out of our way to protect a very young, seemingly affluent, and some people's minds very white, even though that's an unfair categorization, group of people that are at most 1 in 10 of the population, at the most generous. And so I just think we have to figure out a better way to frame how we do this.
Yeah.
Which is not to say we need to tell these rightists to like throw trans people under the bus, because it's not that. I'm not willing to do that.
That's anti-communist. I mean, communists
Right.
have always been about the human rights of minority populations.
Yeah,
You know, and
except
it's just also
when they get craven in like the 30s. But yes,
yeah.
in general,
at least theoretically, yeah.
Right. In general, but you know, and I say this all the time, and people think I'm talking about social issues. I'm like, if you don't want a Nazis, you don't build a Weimar Republic, right? Like, if you really like, you don't go out like, I'm going to fight Nazis. I'm going to stop the social conditions that lead to Nazis being a viable response.
Of course.
And people think I'm talking about like, well, you know, the decadence of the. No, I'm talking about the economic problems. Actually,
100%.
Like people focus on the decadence when the economic problems seem unresolvable.
It's a fucking cope. It is an impasse. I've been calling this the great impasse, because the ruling class has no fucking way out of this. They're muddling their way through. Everybody below the ruling class is coming up with reason after reason after reason to not focus on the terrors of this particular crisis moment in society. And the communist left, or the left in general or whatever, isn't talking about material conditions. They're talking about Democrat programs that can maybe help those things out, but they're not, by and large, I'm saying not everybody, is again oriented towards what we should be oriented towards. And the thing about this country, and I've realized this very vividly over the last 5 years, somebody who voted Ralph Nader in 2000 for president, who's always hated the Democratic Party from the very beginning, is that there is a massive maw, like a black hole, at the center of American, not just politics, but also society in general. That is this like gravitational field that pulls everything into Democrats versus Republicans. Right. It is like insane how powerful this fucking thing is. And it's insane how people, the Bernie socialists and the people that came after that, even if you're calling yourself a Maoist or whatever, are still sucked into this very narrow scheme of debate and discussion about where society should be going. And that's why, again, like, we don't want to be anti-leftist. I don't know. But like it is true that there is, to an extent, a way that communism and the fight for it, the working class's fight for itself, exists, maybe not outside of, but at least only adjacent to the right-left political spectrum that exists in the United States, certainly right now. I think it's possible to stake out a communist position and a communist practice that is cognizant of those things happening, but doesn't make that the center of politics, that instead argues that a different type of politics, a different kind of organization and society is possible, one that's based, again, around the working class and its real, very real struggles, the working class and all of its diversity.
Right. I mean, one thing I think my only addition to that would be, like, I wish we'd stop trying to piecemeal shit. Like, that's something Democrats can do or Republicans can do, because they're essentially trying to patch together whatever established order. We can't make those kind of promises. Like at the end of the day, what do we advocate? We're advocating for a completely different society at almost every level. Like, and admittedly, like, when we talk about this with the working class, I think it's a big sale. Even the working class people, they're like, okay, you know, we're advocating something huge. It seems utopian, but look at what all the people who say their shit isn't utopian give you, which is jack.
Yep.
And sometimes they make things worse for you.
Yep.
I mean, even something like the fight for 15, by now it should be like the fight for 27 or whatever. Yeah. And also, like, capitalism is now giving it to a lot of people anyway because of the labor shortage, because it can. And inflation means it's not going to matter. Yeah. So it's like,
it's a stupid way to say. I'm kind of losing steam a little bit, but like, it's very hackneyed to say it, but like, in some sense, like, the utopianism of communism is more realistic than imagining that Bernie Sanders is going to bring in a return to 1950 style, social democracy in the United States. I think that's literally true. I think you can't go back in time, but everybody wants to be backwards facing. They want to find that point in world history of the left or whatever that they can hitch their wagon to. And I think it's really late in the day for that, because I think that, again, this is a moment of crisis and it's also a moment of possibility, right? I don't think maybe it is the terminal crisis, the Grossmanite terminal crisis, to the extent that like we're not solving the climate crisis. So human civilization like doesn't really have a lot more infinite accumulation on a finite planet left before things get really different really fast. But like, as hard as it is with a depoliticized population, I think ultimately we need to be pointing to like, pointing to like to how what we advocate is different from like an incremental sort of like Democrat culture war sort of narrative.
Yeah, I think we have to, and I think we also have to realize that a lot of our quote allies on the left unquote, even for those of us who don't take this post left thing all that seriously, we're going to get called all kinds of things for doing this, and we're not likely to win. I always like to remind people that, because I personally think it's better to know your odds than someone blow smoke up your ass. I know that this may be like something that people completely disagree with me on, but like,
look at the history of the Trotskyist movements, right? The final struggle was
how many final struggles have we had? like I remember when like you go back and read the thing that we call the transitional program, and it's predicting that capitalism is going to end in the 50s, and it's just like it's like, well, how do you feel about that one? Like,
yeah, well, they're not alive anymore to defend themselves,
right? To be fair to them, but that's a good place they need to end on. I think part of the problem is you've been thinking about the same things for a long time, and there's not a lot of outlets for this. Weirdly,
you're into the regrettable century people.
I am. I work with them on a project now that's about the last mode of production transition, which was antiquity and the feudalism and the capitalism and characters of Europe. And because we are now deciding that that Marxists in general have not looked at prior modes seriously enough because of our tendency to not want to make transhistorical theories, which makes sense. But like, you got to sometimes be realistic about how things happened.
You got to get into your Benagi sometimes. You got to get into your Benagi. I listen to Varn on your various things. I listen to Regrettable Century sometimes. I listen to Swampside Chats, which I think is really good. I read Endnotes. I think they're serious. I read Chuang.
I actually like Swang better than Endnotes, to be completely honest, because I feel like Swang Endnotes does things where like Endnotes has a good point, but then they like say it for all of capitalism and all countries as if it's true the same way everywhere.
Yeah,
and Swang didn't do that.
Endnotes allowed like a decade ago, and I'm friends with literally good friends with one of the guys from Endnotes, and I kind of came up in that milieu. I was at the International Sick Conference with Theory Communist and the remnants of Aufheben and all these groups across Europe or whatever. So that's kind of what I come out of. It opened up, I think, a really interesting intellectual terrain for trying to understand the present moment, if nothing else. I think that I hope Antifada. Yeah, but NF has done great work. Endnotes adjacent. I think Antifada has done a pretty good job. I gotta say, Matt Christman doesn't talk about like this stuff too much. I've been kind of trying to encourage him, and we're going to do an episode on really existing socialism next month.
You are one of the like. So I will say this on air. I don't know Matt. People who know me closely do know Matt. And then there's been like this pool for the great Matt Varn talk, but I don't know what people think they're going to get out of it.
No, I think it would be great actually.
But I've always felt like Christman historical knowledge he was the only person I don't listen to Chapo. I've never really liked it. But when I did listen to it, or when Matt spoke, Matt was the only one who said anything similar to what I thought. Like everybody else was like, I don't even relate to what you're saying. But Matt, I thought, made some sense. But Matt's political instincts, I think it's hard for people to understand. I know a lot of people think he's like, I don't know. I think what he gets stuck in is like this, like he sees a lot of the same things we see, but he's also trying to operate he was trying to operate in the realm of immediate political viability.
Yeah. For sure.
I think he sounds like he's kind of given up on that. I've started listening to his vlogs, to Kush vlog finally.
Yeah.
So
no, I hung out with him the other day, and I can safely say from some private conversations that are going to turn into Antifada History as a Weapon episodes next month when he's back in town, that to the extent that that was true, I think he left it. He had a great, if people aren't subscribed, I know people are actually watching this, it's just not just you and me, but if you're subscribed or unsubscribed, you should subscribe to the Antifada, because in our last episode, we talked about the value form as Antichrist. Which it actually literally kind of is. We had to reach the misty depths of theology, just like Marx did with fetishism, to try to understand that.
So I listed the podcast. I'll do it here too for people listening to me. Don't follow me on, because I actually kind of deliberately keep my Twitter obscure. But
smart.
Although I'm not doing it right now. But one thing I will say is I listen to left. I don't listen to a lot of left podcasts. I listen to Antifada, and I have for a long time.
Thank you.
I listen to Everybody Loves Communism because of its relationship to Antifada. I kind of hate Communism 101 podcast because, like, that's so not me. It's just not
me. I know. You're past
that. And when I'm kind of, as a side note, I'm actually kind of glad I didn't come up in that milieu, because I had to do research, and so I did a lot more of it. Whereas, like, there was no way, no one was going to break down the critique of the Goethe program for you outside of a college class in 2009,
or a sectarian Trotskyist group, maybe.
Right,
if you're lucky.
If you're lucky, if you survived it that long,
right. Later, Platypus would.
Yeah, well, that's where I ended up for that reason. But
a lot of smart people came out of Platypus. Ross Wolf, one of my good friends, also came out of Platypus.
We left at the same time. Actually, Ross and I know each other. Like we met IRL.
Him and Alex Gendler hit me up last night because Anton Yeager was in town. We were gonna get drinks, but we're gonna do it another day this week. So, it's good to be in New York City, you know, like all these fucking people, you know them, they come in, they come out. It's
but people talk to me when they get tired of New York City, and I'm like, new Greenpoint. but to turn this to finish this off, because this is a long conversation, and I hope people stayed around. I do think that people should subscribe to Antifada, because I think actually some of the stuff you guys do on the other side is, like, I think the history of the weapon episodes is probably one of the most clarifying things to Christmas politics I've actually listened to. Before then, I was kind of unclear on what his politics actually really were. I also say Regrettable Century is great. If you want to know, they know their left history, like, and then the Measures Taken, which is a split, which is Jeremy and then some other people who are now going through the history of the early 20th century Marxisms, particularly focusing on before the Third International.
I don't know a lot about that. I need to know.
You said people don't know a lot about it. So like what were Anton Pannekoek, Rosa Luxemburg, Otto Bauer, and Lenin arguing about, and why?
And then all you get online is people like arguing completely ahistorical and like reified sectarian positions. I hate that shit. That could never be me. If there's any like credit why maybe my podcast is interesting to you and like 10,000 other people, is because I never bought that these sort of like historical ideologies, these dogmas, really could exist except outside of like the debates and the practical problems that people had at the time. So it's incumbent upon us, all of us, to like, if you're a Marxist, to read Marx. Yeah. If you're a Leninist, to read Lenin and understand Lenin, where Lenin was coming from. If you're a Stalinist, even, go in and like dig deep into fucking Soviet political economy and history.
And if you're not,
but at least come out the other side like knowing something.
If you're not a Stalinist, also don't be afraid to actually read Stalin. Some of the debates, like pre-1930s debates about Stalin's positions on the national question, will actually surprise you.
Read Bukharin. Read Bukharin, who's both a left and right oppositionist, who's maybe one of the most forward-thinking Marxists of the 19th and 20th
My
century.
favorite anecdote about Bukharin is when he got mad at Lenin in 1818 for not doing enough to abolish the state, published a positive review, and the only issue of the left Bolshevik not opposition, but the left Bolshevik journal Communist reminding Lenin that stated revolution was good. Like, it's the most passive aggressive thing I think I've ever read.
King shit, dude.
Yeah, it's just like, hey, Lenin, you wrote this. It was a good idea.
Like a year or so ago, maybe a couple of years ago.
Like, maybe you should take it a little bit more seriously.
Well, listen, to really round things out, I've been thinking this even before we started talking today, and I don't want this to become like a self-sucking section here or whatever, but you and me should maybe start a project. You don't have to say yes or no now, but this has been, what, 2.5 hours now? We've been going 3 hours now. No, yeah, God. 3 hours now we've been going. So maybe we do like a joint Antifada Mortal Science like series or something like that.
Yeah, I'd be interested in doing particularly if we can get Esri's finishing their degree at math right now, so she's a little bit more indisposed than in the past. But
maybe just you and me.
Yeah, it might be worth doing.
Maybe like
obviously we have a lot to talk about. Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe there's like a few episodes or something. We'll put them behind our paywalls, and the real heads can get down on it.
All right. Well, yeah, we might do that. That's a great idea.
We'll talk about it. All
right. I'll be in contact. Thank you for coming on and talking for 2.5 hours. And hopefully people get it. We talked about a lot of different stuff. I think it was actually super fruitful. And honestly, it was probably we do need to talk more, because any of these substrains could have been a fully developed episode.
I could keep going.
Yeah. Thanks for coming on, Sean. Yeah. And people should definitely check out all the stuff you're doing. And I think a lot of us are going to have a lot of stuff to talk about in the next year, because it's only 2001. I think is only the beginning of how weird this next decade's going to get, because it's
going to be a relevant decade. It's going to be a pivotal decade, just like the famous book about the 1970s called that a pivotal decade. We are in it, folks. We are in this transitionary period. Neoliberals exhausted, and something new is coming. So we should probably be part of that.
What it is.
Could be probably really bad, but I don't know. Maybe it could be good. We'll see.
Right. All right.
All right, man. Thanks so much.
Take care.
Yeah, pleasure.